The way this project started for me was very fascinating, and I'd have to go back a bit of a ways to kind of tell the whole story, how it all began. But essentially, at my first year of university, I'd studied in Athens, in Greece, at the American College of Greece, where I studied archaeology. And it was completely by chance. I never thought I would pursue archaeology. I was just living in Greece, and I thought, well, that's what I'm going to study. And then I ended up moving to California, where I pursued my career in filmmaking. Throughout those years, working in Los Angeles, doing visual effects and animation and post-production, I was getting extremely tired and bored of the film industry in Hollywood and the people that seemed to be absorbed in that industry. About 7 years ago, my family called me. They were in Italy at the time. They'd lived in Italy for many years, and told me that my mother wasn't doing well and that she was in the hospital. And so I took a flight out the same day, and when I arrived, she was already in a coma, and I held her hand for a couple hours and she passed away. And the same month, my father had a stroke, and he was already pushing 90 years old. So I was faced with this moment where I realized I had to step up and do something and decide what our next steps were going to be as a family. I ended up staying in Italy and looking after Dad. He was in the hospital for about 6 months, and then slowly he started recuperating. Little by little, he started getting better. So during that period of time when my father was recovering, I started to get myself back out and pursuing my interests in history and archaeology, and started to film all these fabulous things that are all over Italy, Pompeii, and you have Venice and Rome and Napoli and Palermo. All of Italy is just so rich with archaeological wonders. And this started to bring back my love for history, my love for archaeology, combined with the fact that I was, at that point, a filmmaker.
We're in Venice, it's so cool. The day is good, it's sunny. We're gonna have the best shots, we're gonna have very good lunch.
It's amazing to think this whole city, this is like one of over 100 islands that were man-made, built on wooden stilts, on top of which they built this. So the whole thing is built on wood. Fucking crazy, dude.
That's impressive. Like, also after all this time, still like that? Like
after all this time, it survives, yeah, because of the anaerobic conditions of the wood under the water there doesn't rot. It was roughly about 8 months after my father had a stroke that, through my connections with archaeologists and my group of friends and colleagues, I was put in touch with Merlin Burrows, who are my partners in England. And Timothy Akers, who was just the most extraordinary man. So I ended up going to England, meeting with them, and it turned out that they had this capacity of detecting artifacts that were embedded in soil or in water, that we could somewhat tease out of the imagery, and we could determine if there were objects hidden in that place that we were researching. And a huge percentage of the time, the structures were there. So as a filmmaker, I started to think to myself, my goodness, there is something here that I could dedicate myself to. That's wonderful, and it's worthwhile, and it's noble. And I can apply my skills and my love to this project, to these projects. So that is really when things kicked off. And the first project that we focused our attentions on was in Egypt. Actually, we had two initial projects that Timothy Akers had found in Egypt that we went to examine. The first one of which was the existence of a second Sphinx on the Giza Plateau. A lot of people don't realize this, but the Giza Plateau actually has two Sphinxes. So off we went. I found myself in Cairo, embedded in Egyptian archaeology, Egyptology, and researching the existence of this supposed second Sphinx.
And it's a celebration for discovering a new second Sphinx in the area.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
He's just finished telling us about a second Sphinx. This is great.
Now there is a second Sphinx in the area, looking to the west side. Because the normal one, the first one, was looking to the east.
To the east,
Yeah.
From there, we made our way to Fayoum, Hawara to be precise, which is a couple hours south of Cairo. And in this particular place, there is a very fascinating structure that a lot of people have been trying to research over the last couple centuries, which is called famously the Lost Labyrinth of Egypt. And it sits underneath of this extraordinary, dilapidated ancient pyramid, the Pyramid of Hawara, which is often referred to as the Weeping Pyramid because it was made out of this adobe brick, which doesn't really withstand the weather very much. So once the outer casing shells were taken off, the inside stone started to deteriorate. And under this extraordinary pyramid was purported to be an ancient labyrinth. And the story is fascinating. One of the recollections of this labyrinth was described by a Jesuit priest who had actually gone into the chambers of this labyrinth and said that there were statues and the walls were covered in writing in gold, and he described it as having had up to 3,000 chambers. But then Napoleon came along and for whatever reason decided to tell his chief engineer to build a canal that essentially flooded this entire labyrinth. So something that Napoleon really could have not done, but he did.
Climbing up the Hawara Pyramid to get a little bit of a better view.
From Egypt, we made our way to the shores of northern England, to Filey in Yorkshire, where Tim had discovered the wreck of a very famous galleon, an American warship. But when I say American, in reality, it was gifted by the French to the early American, what the English would call pirates, but in reality, they were the first American naval fleet. And the captain of the Bonhomme Richard, whose name was John Paul Jones, ended up becoming what they refer to as the first admiral of the US Navy. So he was a hero to the Americans and a pirate to the English. Now, the story is fascinating. He basically came in challenging the English fleet, and immediately his ship was hit right from the back, blowing the entire top off the ship and killing 19 sailors in the process. And while his ship was in flames, he pulled off one of the greatest maneuvers in maritime history. And he pulled up his ship alongside the British ship called the Serapis. And his sailors swung over in full-on pirate style and commandeered the Serapis and eventually sailed off into the sunset, so to speak.
Ready, guys? Boy, another big day under the water.
So it was a famous shipwreck, and we're the first people to have located it and to have retrieved numerous artifacts from this ship, which had been burnt to smithereens. So it's a huge discovery. I even feel honored because as an American, working with our English team, it's kind of ironic because it's an Anglo-American research team that discovered this in the end.
Although they're both broken, they're actually within half an inch of the same length of each other.
And what's important to say here is that the wood is extensively burned.
Yeah.
As most of these.
So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 or 7 of these brass pins.
And it's obviously an internal structure because of the nature of what it is. It's brass, not copper.
From there, we made our way to our next project, which was in the area known as the Wash, which is in the Norfolk region of England. And this is a story which is very fascinating. Basically, the foundation of the story is that King John, often known as the terrible King John, was traveling as he did throughout the entire country. He would always be traveling with his group of soldiers, about 3,000 men, and they would collect taxes from every area they would visit in England. At one point, they found themselves on this marshland, which was prone to having tidal surges. And one of his guides suggested that to save time, they should cross across the Wash because it was low tide. So he accepted, although King John went a different direction and therefore wasn't affected. The rest of his 3,000 men and tons of gold and treasure took this path through the Wash, and lo and behold, a giant tidal surge killed them all and buried everything. So it was this famous story of King John's lost baggage train. And Tim had located in the same area which history tells us this occurred. He had located numerous artifacts in the soil. This project took a couple years to kick off because of bureaucracy and permits and all the rest of the paperwork that had to be put together in order to make this work. We finally did it, and it was a big project. It involved divers, archaeologists, professors, politicians. We even had colleagues from the BBC there filming. And it was an extremely difficult place to explore, but super fun. And we did eventually recover about 3 caskets full of material of various types that all indicated that they came from the right epoch, the epoch of King John.
If they were to go a little off to the oblique from that side, if that is the crown, you should pick up another crown about 2 meters away.
Okay.
And then there'll be a gap after that one, and at the same angle,
okay,
you should hit another one.
Okay.
Because there's 4 in a line.
Okay.
So if they hit that, that'd be great.
The still photographer has got a clean shot of all the images, all the layers of them going up. So. It's exciting!
It looks like they're going to have trouble in the pond because of the sediment issue.
Yeah, it's very dark.
But they're going to dig a trench because he managed to wiggle himself down into the mud to get hit terra firma, and then they're going to dig a trench there and then dig around it. And have you got enough there?
Oh, plenty there.
Yeah, right. We should be able to prove beyond reasonable doubt that there is gold there.
That is a project that is ongoing, and we'll be returning there at some point to continue our research. From there, we made our way to the Alsace region in France, which is on the border of France and Germany. And in fact, over the last centuries, it's always teetered between being French and German, and French, then German, and whatnot. And it's the story of Ettore Bugatti, the famous car manufacturer, who was in fact Italian, but had built his factory, his famous car factory, in the region of Alsace for whatever reason. And the story was fascinating because during the First World War, he had buried a couple of his prime race cars because the Germans had come in to try to steal his technology. And so he buried his car, and when the war was over, he was able to retrieve the car and win Le Mans. So the Second World War rolls around, And he gets a call saying, hey, the Nazis are coming, they're after your factory. So he does the same thing. He buries, in his vast fields that he had, he buries 3 of his most famous cars and an airplane that he had been designing. And he buries these vehicles, thinking he was going to do the same thing he did during the First World War. But as fate has it, a few years passed, his son, Jean Bugatti, had a tragic accident while racing one of his cars near the house. And it affected Ettore Bugatti so much that he had a stroke one day while visiting the wreck site, and shortly after died, keeping that mystery of where he buried those cars. So Tim had found what he believed were those 3 cars buried in the fields that used to once belong to Ettore Bugatti. I started to realize that these techniques worked, because every time we were going to these places, the object was there. There's a small percentage of times when we show up and we do a drone flight or we dive at a place and turns out that there is something there, but it isn't what we thought it was. But that's very rare, because almost all of our discoveries begin with a great deal of research. So what we end up finding 89, 90% of the times is what we were out looking for. And it wasn't until one particular day I was getting out of the water from one of our dives, and I was super excited because I had just found with our team this ancient shipwreck. And Timothy, I'll never forget, looks at me and he says, do you like southern Spain? And I said, yeah, why? He says, I have some stuff there that you might enjoy. And from that moment began a series of trips to Andalusia, where, lo and behold, we started finding tons and tons and tons of artifacts that belonged to an ancient civilization. And that is when I recognized that this would be the most important of our discoveries, and this was the project we would have to start with, because of its value, not only as a filmmaker in terms of a film and a series, but in terms of culturally for humanity. The value of what we were investigating in Spain is massive. So month after month, I would fly out here from Italy, and I fell in love with this place. And at one point, I looked at my father and I said, Dad, you wanna go live in Andalusia? And he had been seeing all the videos I was filming there and fell in love with the place as well. And he turned around, he said, yeah, let's go. So I was faced with this exciting new prospect of moving to Spain with my father, my cat, and a house load of stuff. And I thought to myself, how am I gonna do this? My father's almost 90 years old. And so I ended up, one way or another, the way that I thought would be the best way to do it was we got this old camper, and it was perfect. I stuffed it full of all of the stuff from the house, my cat, Smeagol, and my father, and off we made our way 2,500 kilometers from Italy to Sanlúcar de Barrameda.
We're gonna be in San Luca by this evening, just around dinner time. What do you reckon? A good seafood dinner sound good? We're in San Luca, Dad. What do you reckon? Pretty delicious, huh? We made it to San Luca, our new home.
And that's when things really kicked off. And every day, practically, I was learning something new. And every day I realized that there was something here that really needed our attention. And here we are 7.5 years later. And it has changed my life forever.